We have a lot of evidence for what the Bible says from 100 years before this time in history.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, most of what we have from the Assyrian Empire is not from the late 8th century, but from the mid-9th century. And this is the kind of stuff that we have from Assyria, not from Jerusalem. And
Right.
you could almost piece together the biblical timeline of the 9th century just by what we have from the excavations of Assyria. In fact, you and I have been to the British Museum together, and the British Museum has a little bit of everything. I mean, you could spend weeks and weeks in there. But one of the places I always tell people to go is to the Assyrian section of the museum. Not only is it stunning, you get to see the great winged bulls that are guarding the Assyrian entrance, but you can see so much biblical history in the Assyrian section. And some of the main ways that we can corroborate what the Bible says about this time period actually come through the Assyrian reliefs and the different propaganda carvings that they did in their own throne rooms.
Exactly. I mean, literally, if you would think about it, the ancient version of Facebook posts are telling us a lot about history. This was the way that ancient rulers publicized their successes. Now, did they exaggerate occasionally? Yes, but the core facts of what they put out are essentially correct. And, probably one of the most interesting kings that we know a great deal about in this way came about 100 years before, as you said, Hezekiah. Hezekiah began to rule in 715, but 100 years before him, Jehu, who is notable for being one of the very, very few good kings in the northern kingdom. It's during his reign we have a lot of archaeology, as archaeology goes, to tell us about him.
Yeah, I wanted to highlight 3 pieces of Assyrian archaeology that tell the story of Jehu's life. In fact, we know quite a bit about him from the Bible. He lived a very interesting life. He's one of the really interesting characters of 1st and 2nd Kings. But we also know a lot about him from outside the Bible. And one of the artifacts that's really important for biblical history is called the Tel Dan Stele. And this is cool because this right now has been at the Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C. We saw it a couple of weeks ago live. There's a replica there, and we've seen it in the Jerusalem Museum before, but it has been in Washington, D.C. for the last couple of months, and you can see the real piece of stone. And the significance of the Tel Dan Stele is that it is the first mention of David outside the Bible. For a long time, scholars who questioned the biblical record thought, oh, King David is kind of like King Arthur. If he existed at all, he was a tribal king. He was not really known through the rest of the world. This is just kind of their own family history that they're writing down. Well, when this was discovered and people started to read what it said, they realized King David's a bigger deal than we thought he was, because this piece of stone is the first mention of David outside of the Bible, and it is an affirmation that David was considered the founding king of the kingdom of Israel and Judah. So this is from the 9th century. It's written in Old Aramaic, and it tells the story of someone who's defeating or killing the kings of Israel and Judah, Jehoram, who's also known as Joram, and Ahaziah. And if you remember the reign of Ahab is one of the worst kings in Israel. He's the one that Elijah has the showdown on Mount Carmel with the prophets of Baal. He does all kinds of things, but he was a pretty shrewd geopolitical mover. And he is part of what's called the Omride dynasty. His father's name was Omri. He comes to power as a military leader. Interestingly enough, Omri has no lineage in 1st and 2nd Kings. We don't know who his father was. We don't know his father's house. We don't know where they came from, which has led some people to believe that he actually wasn't Jewish at all. Because usually, even if they're a usurper or even if the kingly line is changing, they're from some kind of notable family. They give you a little bit of their background to prove who they were. We don't know anything about this dynasty beyond Omri. His son Ahab reigns. He worships foreign gods. He marries Jezebel, who brings in the worship of Baal and Asherah. And after he reigns, his son and grandson continue what he had done until they are opposed by Elisha. If you remember, Elijah challenges Ahab, and to his face he calls a drought. He he conquers and kills the prophets of Baal, and then he runs away from Jezebel. And while he's out in the wilderness, God tells him that he's going to anoint somebody named Hazael, who is going to be a king in Damascus. And after doing this, Hazael is going to conquer the kings of Israel and Judah. So this happens a little bit later. Ahab's grandson, Jehoram, who's also known as Joram, is king. And during his reign, God tells Elisha to go anoint Jehu king of Israel. This is it happens a couple of times. Think about the David story where you have an anointed king, but somebody else is actually king. And Jehu goes on to fulfill this prophecy. He goes on to depose Joram and Ahaziah. Well, this is exactly what the Tel Dan Stele describes, but it probably wasn't written in Israel. So who was it written by? It's written in this old Aramaic script. It's up in the north, probably written in Damascus, probably written in the court of this king Hazael. Elisha actually goes and meets with Hazael in 2 Kings chapter 8. So all of this gives us a really interesting view into the early life of Jehu. There's commotion in Israel. There is a usurper, Jehu, who takes the throne. There is this other player, Hazael, who comes in and conquers these kingdoms with Jehu. And that leads us to our second artifact that's really interesting about his life, and another one that gives us an insight into what the Bible says, and that is the marble slab of Shalmaneser III.
Yes, the Assyrians are not forgotten, and they're not gone. Hazael has some success in defeating Israel and Judah, but just a few years later, Shalmaneser III gets their act together, and he invades the Holy Lands, invades the Middle East, and he defeats Hazael of Damascus, and he receives tribute from Jehu. So Jehu, who's now the king, based on the story you just told, is not conquered. He decides, I'll pay instead. And he does pay. And the marble slab of Shalmaneser describes these events happening. So as you said, we literally have an almost continuous chronological account of what's happening in the Middle East, particularly in the life of Jehu.
Yeah, one of the things the marble slab says that's interesting is it says Jehu of the house of Omri. And the Bible tells us that Jehu is not from the line of Omri, but it gives you an insight into what the kings in the surrounding areas thought about the kings of Israel and Judah. They saw the line of Omri, just like they saw the line of David, just going to prove another part of what the Bible says, that you have this new family, Omri, the Omride dynasty going down through Jehu. You see all these names in these inscriptions that verify exactly what the Bible says about the kings. The coolest artifact is the last part of Jehu's story, and this is called the Black Obelisk. You can see this at the British Museum as well. Mm-hmm. This is really one of the more significant finds in the ancient world. This Black Obelisk is the same kind of thing. It's a propaganda piece for all the campaigns of the first 30 years of Shalmaneser's military life. And it details his campaigns across the world, going into the Holy Lands, and he has Israel sending him gold and cups and bowls and detailing all the things that they're sending him as tribute. But it also has a picture on the obelisk of a king who is lying down on his face before Shalmaneser III. And based on the hair, the outer garments that have little tassels, like prayer tassels almost on them, most people think, historians think, that this is actually a picture of Jehu, who is a vassal king who is bowing down to the king of Assyria. And when you go in there, you can see on this pillar this picture of a king bowing down. And what you're seeing is exactly what the Bible says was happening at that very time in history. So now we've got evidence from Jerusalem of the relationship with Assyria. We've got evidence on the Assyrian side of the relationship with Israel and Judah. And everything is matching up just like the Bible says. But up until this year, we didn't have any insight in Israel about the relationship with Assyria 100 years later.